Welcome to this audio slideshow presented by Dr. Tina Hocks and Professor Lucinda Platt on their Nuffield Foundation funded research project, Parenting and Contact Before and After Separation.
High rates of divorce and separation have become part of contemporary life in the UK. The parents of almost half the children born today will be separated before those children reach adulthood. There have been increasing concerns about the continued involvement of fathers in their children's lives after a split, with a growing emphasis on the benefits to a child's well-being and other outcomes in helping to maintain those relationships. This has been reflected in government policy, with a clear move towards the establishment of a shared care by default approach, a policy it's hoped might go some way to reducing the figure of 1 in 5 fathers who 2 years after separation has no contact with his child. Whilst a lot of research to date has focused on the impact of a split on the children, it has been increasingly recognised that the mother's mental health as well as her income can be hit hard. It's also believed that parents are likely to be less available and less able to pay attention to their children in the early stage of separation.
Our project, Parenting and Contact Before and After Separation, makes an original contribution to both research and policy by examining 2 aspects. First, how a father's involvement with his child before a separation is linked to the contact he has with them afterwards. And second, whether, and if so for how long, a mother's parenting capacity is affected by separation. So rather than looking in isolation at what happens to a child after a split, we're trying to take a more holistic look at the family, before and after separation, to see if it can tell us something meaningful about what aspects of family life we could support to limit the damage of separation and divorce. This is the first quantitative, longitudinal study that investigates both these questions for the UK. Our research used data from the Millennium Cohort study, which has been following around 19,000 children born to families resident in the UK between September 2000 and January 2002. Parents were first interviewed when their child was aged around 9 months, and our research made use of the information from that plus 4 further surveys completed when they were 3, 5, 7 and 11 years old. We were also able to use information from short questionnaires that parents completed by themselves. The MCS is not only a great resource because of its size and the sheer numbers of children and families that it follows, it asks important questions about family life. We were able to make use of a great range of questions about the sorts of activities a parent did with their child, how capable they felt, parenting arrangements, and contact. Being a cohort study following the children over time, the nature of the questions changes with the age of the child. It's important to note, though, that once a parent leaves a household, the study no longer follows them, and all information about them is collected from the resident parent. That said, details provided in the Understanding Society survey, which does follow non-resident parents after a separation, are quite similar between parents, giving us confidence in what we find. We'll talk a bit more about the families in the study and the questions they were asked. First, Tina talks us through what we looked at and what we found when we began exploring questions about pre-separation parenting and its links with post-separation contact.
In this part of the project, the question we really wanted to explore was, to what extent does a father's parenting when the couple is together drive what happens later if they should separate? It's not a question that has been tackled up until now. Not only do we provide some interesting insights into this question, but we conclude there are indeed strong links between the two. Focusing on families where there had been a separation after 9 months and where the mother remained the main carer, we look at data from 2,700 families. We chose separation after 9 months because we wanted at least one set of information to have come directly from the father. We excluded twins and families where the father had died. As well as analysing the individual samples separating between one survey and the next, we can look at all those who have separated prior to each survey, so for example between 9 months and 5 years, 9 months and 7 years, etc. There were 3 aspects of post-separation contact we wanted to look at. Whether there was any contact at all, if so, how frequent that contact was, and the nature of that contact. In this case, did the child get to stay overnight with his or her father? Let's look at some straightforward analysis of those aspects where parents were newly separated at the time of the different surveys. Around 80% of dads who were newly separated at the age 3 survey had at least some contact with their child. At age 5, this rose to nearly 90%, and then to more than 90% for those newly separated when the child turned 7 and 11 respectively. 1 in 6 of our sample's 3-year-olds with newly separated parents had no contact with their dad, and as we might expect, that figure went down to more like 1 in 10 when the parents separated later on in the child's early life. Looking more closely at how often dads see their children, a quarter saw their 3-year-olds multiple times during the week. For dads who separated when the child was older, nearly a third saw their 11-year-old 3 or more times a week. Including those who had no contact at all, 30 to 40% of dads saw their child less than weekly. From when the children in the study turned 5, there's a question in the survey about overnight stays. Where there was any contact, 73% of 5-year-olds whose parents are newly separated stay overnight with their dad, and this figure rises to more than 80% for 11-year-old children whose parents have recently separated. Looking in more detail at how regularly the child stays over, in around half of cases, the sleepovers occurred often. To look at how closely involved dads are in the upbringing of their children, we used a range of questions in the survey about what sorts of activities they do with them, from changing nappies, feeding and getting up in the night when they are infants, to reading bedtime stories and singing to them as toddlers, playing active games outdoors as they get older. All these questions were used to create a score of how involved a dad they were. We took into consideration a range of other factors, such as how long the parents had been separated, employment, education levels, and whether there were siblings. As well as looking at what they actually do with their child, we also look at what they think about their relationship with their son or daughter. Dad is asked how often he looks after the child on their own, how close he feels to his child, and how competent he thinks he is as a parent. So what patterns started to emerge when we looked at all these things? More involved dads were indeed more likely to stay in contact with their children after separation. There was an even clearer link between a dad's involvement and a higher frequency of contact, and also with more overnight stays. Perhaps the confidence and experience of dealing with the child, as well as the bond associated with regular, independent care, are playing a big role here. Interestingly, when we drilled right down, how competent a dad thought he was didn't really have much bearing. It was very much about actions and closeness, not attitudes. Another interesting thing to emerge in our findings was the impact of time since separation on contact. For all the children whose parents had separated by the time the child was 3 years old, 17% of them had no contact at the age 3 survey. By the time this group of children reached 11, this figure had increased to 28%. Even when taking account of differences in family context, time since separation decreased chances of any contact and decreased frequency of contact. Other factors which increased a father's chances of staying in touch included having a degree and being in work. Also, if the child had older siblings, then it was more likely that contact would be maintained. This seems to suggest that economically secure families found it easier to stay in contact. However, marital status, the presence of younger siblings, the father's age and health had no bearing on contact patterns. A positive message to come out of our research is that fathers who subsequently separate from their child's mother are actually highly involved prior to separation. While we know this is a trend for fathers in general, ours is the first study to look at whether this is also the case for families that experience a separation. We also see that these dads mostly have pretty frequent contact after separation and show that parenting and post-separation contact are linked. It seems that paying attention to family life, specifically parenting before separation, can help us understand and potentially influence contact between fathers and their children after a split. Measures to make it easier for fathers to be more closely involved in parenting through the first decade of their children's lives are likely to have positive payoffs. Certainly there's a message for policymakers who want to see more shared care that these expectations may be unrealistic unless there are increases in fathers' participation in childcare in the family home from the outset. Paternity leave policies and practices are likely to be a key focus. We also need to recognize that a family's socio-economic circumstances are important for post-separation contact, partly because they may limit opportunities for dads to have their child to stay over. The social security system doesn't enable parents to share child-related benefits, such as child tax credit and child benefit, nor do housing benefit rules permit non-resident parents to keep a bedroom for their child.
So we move on now to look at mothers. specifically how a mother's perception of her own parenting abilities are affected by a split, and how that plays out over time. Looking at this is important because how competent a mother feels she is will likely be reflected in how consistent and confident she is dealing with her child. Those perceptions might also be reflected in some way in the child's behaviour. Research to date has focused on the negative effects of a separation on a woman's income, mental health and well-being, and has tended to show that although these things take an initial knock, they do recover over time. Our research focuses in on whether separation leads a woman to think of herself as a worse mother, and if so, whether, to what extent, and how quickly her confidence in her abilities as a mum recover. We also look to see if any other factors are at play in influencing a mum's perception of her parenting competence, including a child's behaviour, which we look at using the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, mother's mental health using the Kessler scale, father's involvement, and a range of other measures. We start off with nearly 13,000 children in the Millennium Cohort study who are living with both parents at age 9 months, and who took part in at least one other sweep of the survey up to the age of 7. By that point, among the 10,000 mothers who stayed in the study, just over 8,000 of them were still in a relationship, and just over 2,000 of them had separated. In order to look at how competent they feel, we need them to have filled in the self-completion questionnaire, and that gives us the numbers you can see on this slide. At the very first survey, when their child was around 9 months old, mothers were asked how competent a parent they thought themselves to be. This chart shows their answers both for mothers who subsequently stayed with the child's father and those who went on to separate. It makes clear straight away that both groups have similar levels of confidence in their parenting abilities at the outset, and therefore that it is not the less confident parents who go on to separate. This was the case even when we controlled for a range of social and economic factors that might be linked to separation. In the surveys that follow, mums are asked a similar question about how good a parent they consider themselves to be, with the options ranging from very good to not very good. Mothers who separated between when their child was 9 months and 3, and between 3 and 5, expressed less confidence in their parenting skills than mothers who stayed in their relationship. At every survey, more separated mothers than unseparated mothers reported not being a very good parent. 3 times as many mothers who separated between age 3 and 5 reported having trouble being a good parent. And importantly, when we looked at mothers further down the line to see if their confidence had improved, it hadn't. Mothers who had been separated for longer tended to view their parenting in no better a light than the more recently separated mothers in the study. So we conclude that we don't see the sort of recovery in parenting confidence that research has shown for other things, like maternal depression, well-being, and income. Digging deeper, we found across the board that higher rates of maternal depression and child behaviour problems went hand in hand with separation, and we think this shows that these factors are largely responsible for the blow to a mother's parenting confidence. Contact with the child's father didn't play a role, and taking into account a child's age did not make a difference. In summary, then, although there is a clear link between separation and mothers' lower estimation of their parenting, this is largely because of the increased risk they face of poor mental health and child behaviour. What we take from all of this is that parenting itself is made more challenging by separation, especially without the presence of the child's father, that being a single parent is inherently tough. It's also possible that the shock of separation may affect a woman's ability to parent, which then has a knock-on effect on the child's behaviour. But we are not able to establish cause and effect here. Finally, looking only for recovery over time in a mother's mental health may not be enough to help get her back on her feet after a split. If it's important to help single mothers establish a happy, healthy home for herself and her child, then this could give all those concerned pause for thought. Psychological and practical support around parenting are likely to be key.
Lucinda Platt and Tina Hocks were presenting the findings from their Nuffield Foundation-funded project, Parenting and Contact Before and After Separation. The researchers can also be heard discussing their findings in 2 podcasts on the Nuffield Foundation website project page, where there are also links to a summary report and the more detailed research papers.